Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Arizona International Film Festival, the 29th year that the film festival has been in our community. And because of the obvious reasons, because of COVID, a hybrid version where we will have about 12 in-person screenings and many other virtual events, not just screenings, but virtual events like this panel discussion that we're going to be having today. So the audience is a lot greater. Welcome to everybody that is joining us, either here in Arizona or around the world for that matter. So technology allows us to be a little bit more universal and international in this case. Today we have a very, very good panel. I've been looking forward to this discussion all week long. I'm going to introduce the panelists first, and then we'll go with each and every one by one. But before we do that, once again, we're here to discuss the film and the topic. Let the People Decide, a film by Mr. Gavin Guerra, who is available. The film is available on the film festival virtually. Uh, it's about voter suppression, a very topical issue, and we will be having that discussion. But before we do that, we have some opening statements from Southern Arizona's Congressman, Congressman Raul Grijalva. Those are recorded message, and we're going to go to that first, and we'll come back and we will begin the discussion. So, Congressman Grijalva, you are on.
First, let me thank the Arizona Film Festival for hosting this very important panel. These distinguished individuals are going to talk about voter suppression. Over 245 bills have been proposed across this country by predominantly Republican legislatures to restrict and suppress voter participation and access to voting. In Arizona alone, 40 bills to do the same thing, to limit voting, to suppress voting, to target certain populations of voters, and make it difficult, if not impossible, to fully participate in elections. The right to vote is a hard-fought cornerstone of the civil rights movement, of the women's movement, and that movement to defeat racist Jim Crow laws, to defeat the and keep women from fully participating in our society. Those were all about franchising all Americans and empowering equality for all Americans through democracy and through voting. Retaining power without full electoral participation on the part of voters is fake and it's dangerous. Skewed to narrow ideologies and moneyed interests, they're not about the public good or will, they're about retaining power. H.R. 1 passed the House of Representatives and now in the Senate. It's a national voter protection and participation piece of legislation. It's a bold package of government reforms to increase access, to protect participation, to keep dirty money from influencing campaigns, and to set for the nation a standard of full participation for people eligible to vote in this country. That's where we should be going. It's now in the Senate, and we hope that the Senate joins with us and ignores the filibuster 60-vote limit and votes to defend democracy and to make sure that everyone can fully participate in this great society of ours. America's work around voting is America's story. It's an imperfect union and the effort to make it more perfect. And the key issue is to vote. It is no coincidence that the legislation that is targeting certain communities of color, that is targeting young people, that is targeting the disabled, is to limit the participation of Americans in the direction that their country should go. We shouldn't be afraid of letting people vote. We should be afraid of a narrow group of individuals retaining power and controlling the agenda for the state of Arizona, for local elections, and for our national government. This panel will talk about that. And we'll talk about the importance of defending our democracy, the importance of everyone has the right to vote in this nation, and that needs to be protected. I hope that after this panel discussion, that you will become energized to work within your local communities to make sure that the right to vote is indeed a right that we have earned and a right that we have to protect. Thank you so much, and thank you to the Film Festival.
Very well, and once again, thank you and welcome to the Arizona International Film Festival. Like I said, we have a very good panel, interesting panel for these trying times. Like I said, I'm going to introduce the panel first, and then we'll start off with Mr. Gavin Guerra. The first gentleman that we have is the gentleman that brought us this particular film, Let the People Decide, Mr. Gavin Guerra, who comes to us from Connecticut. He is a professor at New York Film Academy and also at Montclair University, I believe. We also have Pima County Recorder Gabriela Cáceres Kelly, who just recently made history by becoming the first Indigenous woman to be elected countywide in Pima County to the Pima County Recorder's Office, which in effect is in charge of registering people to vote. We also have Flavio Bravo, who is the director of the Arizona Democracy Collaborative, a multi-racial coalition dedicated to long-term strategic planning around democracy reform in Arizona. First-generation college student. Thank you for being with us. And then last but definitely not least, we have Montserrat Arredondo. She is the executive director of One Arizona, which deals with voter registration drives statewide, and also a part of a larger coalition of groups and organizations that are trying to do good work in the state of Arizona. So again, welcome. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. Let's start off with the filmmaker, Mr. Guerra. I think the question is obvious, but it must be made. Why did you decide to do a film on this topic, and how did it go for you?
Yeah, it's kind of a story. I'll try to keep it brief. It started with reading a book that was a Pulitzer Prize winning book by a man named Taylor Branch called Parting the Waters. And it's the first of a trilogy on the civil rights movement. And I read that book really without intent. It was just like a plane ride book. I picked it up for a long plane ride, and I was astonished at how little I knew. That I went through my entire life to that point without knowing any of this stuff. And it was, growing up in a middle class white, environment, going through public school, you're taught Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, maybe a little Malcolm X, and the March on Washington, and then you're on to something else. And that's kind of the extent of your civil rights background. And it's so much more than that. And so there was a character in that book, a real person, not a character. His name was Bob Moses. Now to a New Yorker, Bob Moses is a guy who builds bridges and tunnels. And it was a subject of another famous book called The Power Broker by Robert Caro. This Bob Moses was not that Bob Moses, and this was a very different person, and he was very enigmatic, and I wanted to know more about him. So I kept pitching this idea of a documentary to my documentary filmmaker friends. I had not made a documentary to this point. I have a strong background in visual effects for film and television for the last 30 years. And they kept politely declining because they had their own projects. And so I put it away, and I didn't think anything of it until I went to this museum called the Museum of the Moving Image in Astoria, Queens, New York. And it was a cast reunion for the miniseries Roots. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but it was the highest rated TV movie miniseries of all time. and 75 million people a night would tune in to watch this thing. And it was a seminal moment in television about slavery and the African slave trade in America. And LeVar Burton and Ben Vereen and Lou Gossett Jr. and Leslie Uggams were on stage, and they were talking about all the struggles that they went through in America being an actor. And make a long story longer, they challenged the audience, and they said to us, in the audience, they said, what are you doing today to make society a better and more just place for everybody? Because they were a little put off by the idea that racism was over, because this sort of was at the height of Obama's powers. And I think people were kind of, sitting back on their heels a little bit. And they were like, no. You guys need to understand that this is not something that just ends. And so I turned to my friend on the spot and I said, I'm going to make this movie about Bob Moses. And he said, who's Bob Moses? And I said, see, this is why I need to make this movie. And that's where it started. And it turned into so much more than that, into a 60-year journey over the history of the battle for voting rights. And while Bob is featured primarily in the first act, I brought it into the present day because it became evident that this story is not a historical story, it's a present story. And that connecting those dots from then to now and providing historical context to the moment we find ourselves in is immensely beneficial to having informed discussions with people over how we got here, right? And I think, and I say it over and over again, is so often people are just asking the wrong questions, and they are focused on the what rather than the why. And the why is always more important than the what. And until we sort of reconcile that, we're gonna have serious issues, continue to have serious issues going forward. But that's the origin story of the project. I thought it would take 6 months. It took 6.5 years. But this is where we find ourselves.
Well, Mr. Gab, I think it's very indicative of the many things that the film festival does. It takes an issue and it puts it together with the filmmaker, because in my opinion, filmmakers are storytellers and they have something to say, especially independent filmmakers. And I've seen films from all over the world that are shown here at the film festival, but it hits home. And here we have a documentary that was done, somebody that I've never met in the East Coast, but it's very prevalent not only during these times, but here in Arizona, especially for those of us that work day in and day out with constituencies in the voter registration world. And that takes us to our second panelist, is Gabriela Cáceres Kelly, who threw her hat in the ring last summer. I was around when she decided to say, I'm going to run for Pima County Recorder. And I think I'm going to let you take it from here, Gabriela, because I think that the very first reaction from people was, what, are you crazy? And if you could tell us about your decision to run, the history-making process, and what your duty is, because voter suppression is a little bit harder to, at home with your background and what you're planning to do. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure thing. Well, first of all, Skuktash, Anya Nyapchugi, Gabriela Cáceres Kelly, Bisanmo Amjid. Good day. My name is Gabriela Cáceres Kelly. I'm from the communities of Bisanmo and Kupk, which are located on the Tohono Nation, which is right here in beautiful Pima County, the southernmost part of Arizona and a part of Congressman Grijalva's district. And I am the newly elected county recorder, and much like Gavin, my whole journey really started out by chance, by happenstance. I'd always been kind of interested in voting, but it wasn't until I worked at Tohono Community College, which is a tribal community college here in Arizona, that we were planning to just have a voter registration table for our students for 2 afternoons. We thought it would take 2 afternoons to get all of our students registered on campus. We only had like 300 students, but I was serving in a tribal community where students majority were either tribal members or non-natives who were living in rural areas, and we even had some out-of-state students. And right away, we started encountering barriers that these students were experiencing, and there were so many questions that no one had ever thought to ask. So I was just trying to help students, and I would call the recorder's office and I would ask them this question that 5 of my students or 10 of my students all had, to just try to get them registered. And I was encountering questions, or sometimes I would be transferred a number of times, or I would have to wait for an email back. And I was realizing, wow, all of this just to get registered. And here we are pointing our fingers at people saying, why aren't you registered to vote? Why aren't you participating? And people aren't recognizing that it's actually really difficult simply to get registered, much less to participate. And so it really started a journey of research and self-reflection. And for me, one of the things that I thought was really important was, we were coming up on this 2020 women's suffrage, women having the right to vote, 100-year centennial. And that was like a very common thing that people were talking about. And I realized, I thought about it for just a moment, and I realized, wait, my grandmother was born in 1918, but she wasn't a part of that because uh, even though in 1920 we would have gotten women's suffrage, she wasn't considered a United States citizen being born Thon Autumn until 1924. But then, of course, it wasn't until 1948 in Arizona that when World War II veterans came back from combat, that they tried to register. They were denied. They fought for the right to register. And then they won when my grandmother, her name was Catherine Jose Maria, when she was 30 years old. That's in my family. And so we think about, the civil rights movement, and I think a lot of times we think of it how happening elsewhere. But it wouldn't have given her the protection to not be turned away or not be subject to a literacy test until 1965. Haba inhuripat be smart kmirganyak. But my grandma didn't speak English. She was a brilliant woman. She was so smart. She was a respected elder in our community, but she did not have the right to an interpreter until the 70s, which wasn't that long ago. My oldest brother was born in the 1970s, and so as we continue having these conversations about who is voting and who isn't, and why, and the finger pointing that goes along with that, we're really seeing how many of us have different starting lines. And then with my new position as recorder, I'm really seeing that on the legislative side. I'm seeing bills that are anti-voter in nature, and it is overwhelming to even elections officials, and people are stunned into what they can do to fight back against it. And so it feels very much as if we've solved this problem, that everyone has equal access, and in truth we don't. And so thank you for making this film and bringing attention to this issue, and thank you for having me on this panel today to have these conversations. It's very important. Thank you.
No, thank you, Gabriela, for putting your name on the line, and getting out there, and again, I want to reemphasize that you're not just going to be registering people to vote out of the reservation. You're going to be registering the whole county. Anybody who's eligible to vote should register to vote and should vote, and then fight with the rest of us on these state bills. We the congressman was talking about 245 to 300 bills nationwide that are voter suppression bills, which other people claim that it's voter integrity. In the state of Arizona, I believe we have about 23. I'm about to be corrected probably by Flavio or Montserrat. A lot of them dealing with shortening the span of the vote by mail timelines. But here to talk about something like this and what they're doing is Flavio Bravo, who works statewide. Tell us a little bit about your efforts, Flavio.
Yes, thank you, Ruben. Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel discussion. I am here on behalf of the Arizona Democracy Collaborative. We're a multiracial coalition of 7 progressive civic engagement organizations dedicated to long-term democracy reforms statewide. We realize that we're in the midst of a generational shift as Arizona's demographics continue to change. In understanding this, we believe that our elected officials must adapt to better represent the public's growing needs. When I share with others that the work that we do, and they say, "What does that mean? What is democracy reform? What does the word democracy mean in your work?" In many ways, I want to thank Gavin and kind of invite them to take the time to watch this film, because I feel like so much of the work that we do was covered. But our goal is to defend and strengthen Arizona's democracy through advocacy, public education, and organizing. We work together so that communities most impacted by systemic attacks on their right to vote and participation in our democracy are centered in these reform efforts statewide. So some examples include that were actually covered in the film: restrictive voter ID laws, the prohibition on ballot collection, the reduction of access to polling places. I still remember when a previous county recorder suggested, with these long lines at these polling places, we don't need more polling places, we just need more doors at each polling place. I remember when I heard that, and I thought, how could that be an actual proposal, right? While the majority of our work is centered on boosting long-term civic engagement locally, we are also dedicated to partnering with national orgs in order to focus on important legislation that Congressman Grijalva mentioned and he's co-sponsored, including the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. To expand on the point regarding federal bills, we are still in a global pandemic where state lawmakers across the country have had the opportunity to focus on delivering robust public health plans for their constituents. Yet instead, in a backlash to a historic voter turnout in the 2020 general election this past November, many state legislatures have focused on instead making it more difficult and more burdensome to vote in our elections. As recent as this past February, the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law stated that Arizona leads the nation in proposed voter suppression legislation this year, with the status of Arizona's permanent early voter list, the PEVL, which has widely been successful and popular practice for over 25 years. The status of PEVL still remains in jeopardy. Each of the restrictive bills makes it a greater case for why we need a federal standard to defend our voting rights and protect the integrity of our elections. And so with that, I want to thank the congressman and thank the filmmaker as well, and all of you for being part of this important conversation.
Thank you. I was reading somewhere earlier in the week that the majority of these bills really have nothing to do with transparency and voter integrity, but it has everything to do with the voter turnout of this last election. So, the people turning out should be a good thing. Again, about 23 bills being proposed in the Arizona State Legislature. Let's see what kind of activity happens in the upcoming months with that. And with that, I'd like to also introduce Montserrat Arredondo. Montserrat is the executive director of One Arizona, again, another statewide organization, part of a larger coalition to do good work in the state of Arizona. Montserrat, thank you for being with us. You're muted. There you go.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you all. So good to see Gabriela on the call here, and just a reminder of our people running for office and getting involved and how a spark can make that happen. But again, yeah, my name is Montserrat Arredondo, and I run the C3, which is a nonpartisan community-led organization called One Arizona. It is a coalition of 28 organizations now, across the state that come together around civic engagement and civic engagement work. They'll focus on an array of issues like environment, human rights, women's rights, but really come together in this same thought process that it is our right to vote, and that representation of community members, people that look like us, that run for office and need to be supported, needs to come and start from us being involved. And then through the coalition, we have registered, we have turned in over 600,000 voter registration forms since 2010. And we've quadrupled the number of Latinos on the Pebble, which, we were just talking about being under attack. That's the permanent early voter list, and have seen more Latinos, people of color, vote because of programs like the Vote by Mail program. And also since 2012, Latino registration was at 50%. It's now at 65%. So we are seeing more involvement, more people registered, but we're also seeing more and more attacks at the legislature around voting and the facilitation of voting. So those things are happening at the same time, and it's not a coincidence that those things are happening at the same time. And films like this show that. I looked up the book that Gavin brought up right away, so I can listen to it and read it too, because it's just so important to be informed and listen and hear and watch. I think more and more folks are becoming aware. It's getting harder and harder for folks that don't want the community to vote to do that kind of thing. I think that young people that have been at this for a long time are really seeing a difference, that people are paying more attention. And this is not just an Arizona issue, but a national issue. And if this is something that matters to us, if democracy is something that matters to us as a nation, then we need to step up and be that. And yeah, that's a little bit about us. And I'm also born and raised here in Phoenix, Arizona. And really excited to be a part of this discussion and talk to you all about voting and this film.
Thank you, Montserrat. If there's a silver lining in all of this, it's just that as I look at my screen with the Brady Bunch style squares, is the very first thing that jumps at me is people of color and the age. Both Flavio, Montserrat, and Gabriela, kudos to you, because if you are what not only the future looks like, but the now looks like, I think we'll be in pretty good hands, even though we have a lot of work ahead of us. I mean, it is now, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but it is now illegal to give somebody water for anybody that's waiting in line in Georgia to vote. That's where we're heading. And Gavin, you were able to get quite a few interesting characters of real life people on your film. You want to tell us a little bit about that? I mean, you have Congressman Lewis there.
That's right. So yeah, honestly, that started again with Taylor Branch, who wrote that book that I had mentioned. He was the first person I called. I just emailed him and said, look, I'm looking to make a film about Bob. Would you be interested in participating? And he said, I'm only going to participate if Bob thinks it's okay. Like, I'm not gonna be a part of a film that Bob is not sanctioning. So then it became about getting Bob Moses on board, right? And now, who am I, right, to just knock on Bob Moses's door and say, hey man, I'm some strange white guy who's going to make a film about you. And I ended up going through a friend of mine whose father was a famous movie star back in the day named Eli Wallach. So his son is a good friend of mine who knew Harry Belafonte. And a lot of people don't know, and you will read in that book, that Harry Belafonte was actually Martin Luther King's sort of bail bondsman. Like, anytime people got arrested in mass, Harry Belafonte was the bag man who would get all the money to bail everybody out. He would hit up all the Hollywood stars. He would have a concert. He'd do whatever he could to help, and he would deliver the cash. So I went and had a long 3-hour meeting with Harry Belafonte, trying to get him to introduce me to Bob Moses, who I knew that they knew each other. He said, sure, anything I can do to help. And then he proceeded not to help. And it wasn't that he was being a jerk about it. It was just, he was the busiest 88-year-old guy I had ever met at the time. And I couldn't get a hold of him again, really. So what happened, the seminal moment, and it's in the film, was the Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision. It came down in June of 2013. And I just kind of like my head exploded and I said, I can't wait anymore. I can't just wait around to start interviewing people. I need to get on this. So I took it upon myself and I just called Bob Moses's company, the Algebra Project, and I got his assistant, his lovely assistant on the phone, Ben, who said, well, why don't you pitch it to me? So I gave him my elevator pitch. And he said, well, Bob's in Atlanta. Give me 10 minutes. And he called back in 5 and said, sure, Bob's on board. And I was like, that was it? Like I waited months, like it took no time flat. And no pun intended, as soon as Bob Moses was on board, it was like the waters parted. Everybody jumped on board. He is held in such esteem by his colleagues, and no one outside the movement really knows who he is. But inside the movement, he was every bit as large as a John Lewis or a Martin Luther King. I mean, the people who know. And so getting John Lewis, getting Julian Bond, getting Cortland Cox, getting all these sort of luminaries of the civil rights movement, it took nothing. Like literally, as soon as Bob gave the word that people were going to cooperate with me, people cooperated with me, and it was that easy for me. It was a little breathtaking to be able to interact with these kind of titans. These are first person accounts. They were living history. And I was, and as you saw at the end of the film, many of them have died since I made the film. So I really feel very lucky to have had the time I had with them to capture their stories and really preserve them for generations who may not have or won't have that opportunity.
Well, now we have students in Phoenix area at school that want to view this on this film on Thursday, because it's part of the curriculum to study voter suppression. Gabriela, you want to tell us a little bit about your campaign last year and how you started and what you went through, because that in and of itself is the movement, here in Southern Arizona.
Sure. Sure. And then I'd also like to touch on some of the on the voter suppression bills that are going through too. I was seen as a radical. I was seen as, I was running as a progressive Democrat, and I was running against the endorsed candidate of the previous recorder, who had decided to close early voting stations on the Pasquayaki Nation. And despite being in the middle of a pandemic, despite a lawsuit from the tribe and so much support throughout the state, would not reopen them. And so we were really talking a lot about disenfranchised communities, and I was talking boldly about things that people really don't like to talk about. I was talking about systemic racism. I was talking about white supremacy and systemic barriers that have been in place since the creation of the vote. Being able to talk boldly about all of those things, I was cautioned, and I was literally told, you need to tone down the Native and not talk about that community as much. You really need to be thinking about the in-town voters and why they should vote for you. And really there was this attitude of like, well, what's going to happen if we have this left-thinking Native American woman come and start running the show? And I think people were really concerned that I was going to treat them the way that they've treated Natives, because there was a little bit of pushback. But, it turns out that people really do care and really do understand that their right to vote is under attack. And when we started talking about communities of color, and we're having this national conversation about race, during the pandemic, we were seeing protests and Black Lives Matter protests downtown, and we were seeing all of, we're still talking about children in cages, and we're talking about communities of color that didn't have access to testing for COVID or to the vaccine, and it was just continuing on. And so I was talking about things like how Arizona is part of the prison industrial complex and how that impacts full generations of communities in regards to whether or not they can vote. And it was shocking to people, and people were so they would literally, we were in Zooms, and I would see people's eyes just widen as I talked about white supremacy and how it has impacted and still does impact voting. And then people would start to think about it, and you would see nodding, and you're like, oh my gosh, they're having a realization. And so by boldly talking about things that people told me not to talk about, we won, I think, 65% of the vote in the primary, which was a landslide win. And then I went up against a Republican opponent who was literally talking about just voter suppression, just left and right, really trying to sound reasonable. And it's the reasonable conversations that are really super dangerous. But even he, there was too much momentum. We talked a lot about, I adopted this slogan of Indigenous woman coming through. There's actually a viral video of me riding a scooter, yelling this in DC, excuse me, Indigenous woman coming through. And that's the mantra we took. You either you get on board or you get out of the way. Because we're done asking for permission to be in these spaces and talking about the issues that are actually interacting with our communities. And it's down ballot candidates who were able to raise that interest in awareness and education for people to vote when I'm talking about things like prison industrial complexes and in communities of color, and they're like, oh, that's my family, that's happened to me, and they're able to connect with that for the very first time. And we were having so many people register to vote so they could vote for me. And while they're at it, let's vote for some of the other candidates they may not be as excited for. And we had a small margin of here in Arizona to put Joe Biden in. And so, that's the kind of work, and it's talking to communities about things that are real to them, and not promising to care and actually caring. And so it has been it was a really powerful win, and a real huge win for progressive politics here in Southern Arizona, because it really did show that if you talk about things that are actually cared about in the community and that are actually impacting communities of color, then you're more likely to have communities of color participate. And right now, Ruben keeps saying, 35 bills or 25 bills or something like that. In Arizona, there were 135 bills that were introduced into the legislature, which meant my staff had to read 135 different pieces of legislation that were impacting our office. None of the elections officials throughout the state could even keep up with the number. And what they did was they kept that legislation in play so much longer than they normally. You read something like, oh, this is stupid, it's not going to go anywhere. And then they would put it up for second read. Then they would assign it to committee. And so you were having to follow so many more pieces of legislation. And so what was happening was you were not able to meaningfully research or discuss or fight back against any of this legislation that was just coming. Sometimes 10, 20 bills would be dropped in a night. And so we weren't able to really engage with this in the way that should be engaged with, or to go and to testify against some of this legislation or any of that. And so it's whittled down. Now it's only, there's 20, 30 or whatever. We're still leading the country in the number of anti-voter bills. But on top of that, even if none of them pass, what this has done is it has planted the seed of doubt. And so even if nothing bad gets passed, it has shaken the confidence of our constituency and the people who are on the cusp of deciding whether or not to vote, whether or not it actually is going to impact them, whether or not their voice is actually going to be heard. And so even this onslaught of the dropping of legislation has this detrimental impact to our communities that we will not be able to determine until uh, you know years down the line. But the damage is being done already.
No, history shows that Arizona has always been in the forefront of, of the many movements within the United States and Mexico, for that matter, and the lives of indigenous people. Everything from the Apache stronghold to voter suppression, to the Mexican American War. I mean, so Arizona has always been at the cusp of all these struggles. In recent history, however, it is just my humble opinion that there was a turning point electorally in 2010 with SB 1070, which was an anti-immigration bill. But what I think that bill did, it galvanized Latino community into action, which is where Montserrat and Flavio come in, and obviously Gabriela. And Flavio, you want to talk about some of the work that you've done and some of the work that you will be doing, I'm assuming, against some of these bills?
Absolutely. The idea of 1070 being really a moment to reflect and think about where we are as a state. One of the bills that's out there right now, and as proposed, it has not died yet, as they say, is it would be a class 5 felony if somebody helps another person vote by mail. And I did go to college out of state. I never missed an election. And I studied in Chicago, where all the local organizers were saying, you vote where your feet are, vote here. And I would say, I hear you, but I'm from Arizona. And they'd say, okay, go vote. We need you to vote in Arizona. They understood that. I had professors who took pride in the idea that their books on Latin American studies were included in Arizona's banned book list, right? So I have always thought very, very carefully about the role that Arizona plays. And even when I think of the role of on January 6th, the insurrection at the Capitol, the fact that it was calling the votes to confirm the electoral college results for the state of Arizona, the fact that the guy with the bullhorns is from Arizona, Gavin's documentary does focus on the role of Barry Goldwater. And, when you say you're from Arizona and you go and you travel out of state and you speak to people that you want to engage politically and you want to pursue a career in public service, sometimes that's the only reputation they think of is what that Barry Goldwater left behind. And I think that the leaders here, like Gabby and Montserrat, I'm so grateful to say that we are holding ourselves to a different standard and to one that sets an entirely different tone to what we will pursue here statewide. And right now, we are working on a campaign to protect Pebble. You can see T-shirts. You can see, I see yard signs saying "I Heart Pebble," but we also want to participate in such an important conversation around the For the People Act. We know that some of these federal bills can be so wonky that not everybody can understand the different provisions. What does it mean to enact automatic voter registration? What would it mean to remove big money out of politics? Somebody told me that they started having a conversation about this with their dentist, and their dentist said, we just really need to pass HR 1. And they thought, wow, how is that possible that even their dentist would be engaged in an issue like that? But the reality is that the majority of the people we work with are not dentists. They don't have backgrounds in having gone to medical school or college. So if we can make very, very complicated issues seem more understandable and help people realize how it does impact them and their families, I think we'll be very successful.
Flavio, right at the passage of SB 1070 back in 2010, I think it was 2011 that I was invited to speak at the Guadalajara Book Festival of all things. And they wanted to know, a book festival wanted to know what the hell was going on in Arizona. So I kind of painted this picture of, Arizona, honestly, and, it included Governor Jan Brewer, Arpaio, SB 1070, on and on. And one of the first questions afterwards from the audience is, man, Arizona, why do you live there then? And the answer is simple, because that's where I'm from. And I'm not going to run away to some make-believe state that doesn't have these types of problems. So we're going to stay, we're going to mobilize, energize, encourage, and confront the situation head on. And I think that's what people like Montserrat Arredondo are doing. You want to tell us a little bit about your efforts, Montserrat, por favor?
Yeah, and I think Gavin might have had something he wanted to say.
Yeah, I was just gonna give a little bit of context because that's kind of what I do. A lot of people may not know what SB 1070 is, and it was better known nationwide as the Papers, Please law, where they could round up people who looked like illegal immigrants and demand their citizenship papers. Now, why is that important to voting? Well, that bill was authored by none other than Chris Kobach. Chris Kobach was the chairman of President Trump's Voter Integrity Commission that collapsed under its own weight. And he was Secretary of State of Kansas, where he kept getting clobbered in court by none other than Dale Ho, who is of the ACLU Voter Rights Project, who's in my film. And it was so bad for Chris Kobach that the judge sent him back to remedial law school to learn how to handle evidence. Right. So, but that law, SB 1070, was crafted by Kobach with the help of ALEC, which is a conglomeration, a corporate conglomeration funded by the Koch brothers. And what they do is they introduce the same law in various state houses. They just cut and paste the text out and they go around. And that's why you're seeing all these voter suppression bills nationwide are all kind of the same voter suppression bills nationwide, because they're playing from the same playbook. Okay, and that's the coordination that's happening. And it, as you pointed out at the beginning, it's only GOP state houses that are doing this, right? Because it's not an accident, right? They lost the election. How can we fix that? Well, this is how we could fix that, right? And so it's a little more, kind of Bond villainy in some way, than I would care to have it be, right? If it was literally just an organic grassroots thing, that would be one thing, but it's really not. It's very much, marching orders that are going out across the country in these state houses. And people like Chris Kobach, who has that Arizona history at SB 1070 as a Kansas guy, which makes no sense to me. I don't quite know how he ended up doing that, but I just wanted to sort of thread that needle that you guys were talking about, because it all comes together, in a very not so nice way.
Well, thank you. I again, being from Arizona, I just assume that everybody knows what SB 1070 is, and your professoral skills come into play, not just as a filmmaker, Mr. Gavin. You talk about a grassroots effort. The reaction, however, to SB 1070 has been very organic. It has been very grassroots-like, and it's led us to where we are today, where we're having a lot of great organizations, such as like the one that Montserrat Arredondo is working on. You want to tell us about that, please?
Yeah, and I'll just add to what Gavin said. Here in Arizona, the sponsor of SB 1070, Russell Pierce, was actually recalled. That was the first time in history that had happened here by community members. So folks went out in the streets, collected signatures to recall Russell Pierce for introducing that bill. So there was a quick response, and it was a grassroots effort, and it showed the power of the people that although we were battling against this big money, we're able to go out, put our boots on the ground, and get this person recalled. And since the beginning of our work, we've seen a lot of challenges at the legislature. One year, I remember they were trying to make it harder for organizations to do voter registration. So only county recorders could do it. And then this year, I believe they're trying to limit where county recorders can do.
They tried to criminalize it so that if county recorders had like a voter registration table outside of government offices, that we could get a felony, which would then make us ineligible to vote. And of course, there's so many bills that have tried to criminalize us.
Oh my gosh. And it's just a round robin of things that are causing for voter registration drives to not happen, and therefore voter registration to be limited. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, the work that we have done as a coalition. Again, we're 28 organizations across the state, really started in 2010 and then saw a big growth again in 2016. You can imagine that election that happened that year. Our coalition really diversified after the presidential race that year. We saw more Black organizations come to form and be funded, more Native organizations form and be funded, as well as AAPI organizations in the state. So although we are majority Latino when it comes to people of color, there are different constituency groups that have different issues. We're really fighting for Pebble, and that's also something that isn't necessarily the need or want of tribal communities, right? So we're trying to balance like the things that we are fighting for and pushing for that include all of the people that we want to be able to vote and participate in elections. And this last year was super hard for everybody. We pulled people out of the field because of COVID. We were trying to keep folks safe. And we saw a lot of things get facilitated, like registering online became a little easier. That traditional address, we finally were able to get past that on the online voter registration. And then we saw things at the polling site, like drive-through, where you can drop off your ballot. Like things that's like, oh, we should really hold on to that, or that wasn't happening before, that everybody benefited from. And there's also another reminder about vote by mail that other states were trying to pick up, but really in Arizona, we've been doing for so long. This is not something new. People are used to voting by mail here, and it was something that was highlighted and seen more of this during COVID, during the pandemic, in a presidential election year. So we saw a lot of great changes and adjustments from county recorders and election officials that are getting challenged right now. But again, everybody benefited from these things. And those are the kinds of things that we know can be set in place to facilitate voting, already were. And there's no excuse. There's no excuse against them.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, you're absolutely right about everybody benefited. One of my favorite moments post-election, this last 2020, is then you see all the pundits, with those maps, those fancy maps, trying to tell us what happened in this state and that state and this part of Wisconsin and whatever. But one of my favorite moments, and I'm forgetting who the gentleman was, but he started crediting groups such as Lucha, Mi Familia Vota, and whatnot for their 10-year efforts.
Yes, on CNN.
And CNN, exactly. And that is the reason that Biden won in Arizona. Nothing against Biden, but it really wasn't the Biden ground game that won him Arizona.
I thought it was my phone banking that was the difference. I was.
It was organized.
Van Jones who shared that comment.
And Gabriela out in the reservation, working day in and day out, boots in the ground, going door to door, and getting the people out to vote. And that is what gave the cushion, not to go from the top to the bottom, but from the bottom to the top. And then witness, Senator Kelly, witness the presidential election, and then witness, the local elections like Gabriela, so props to you guys. Gabriela, you want to comment something about that?
Oh, just that for Yeah, there was so I'm constantly saying that too. There was two big um conversations after the elections. Was number one that Native American communities, right, they had like really high turnout here in Arizona. If you look at a map of like where the Democratic turnout is and where Native American tribal communities, there's 22 distinct tribal nations here in Arizona, and 21 official tribes here, and you could just see it was like a a paste over kind of a situation, and with Pebble, it's a very complex issue, but Native communities are in support of permanent early voting lists and vote by mail. Definitely benefit from it. It's just a little more complex because there's few places to register, few post offices and post office boxes, and a lot of times the distance is an issue, which is why HR1 or some of this the what they call the ballot harvesting or the ballot collection law that's being challenged in the Supreme Court right now. Part of the reason that that's such a big deal is because it's disproportionately shown to impact and be racially motivated to keep communities of color who are most dependent on that, on collecting your nana and your tatas, your next door neighbors' ballots, and making sure that they get dropped off, because those things aren't able to happen. We're seeing, like we were looking at the Navajo Nation, where you have a huge drive for people, and it's not, you're talking about standard versus non-standard addresses, and a lot of people don't even understand what that is. I have a standard address here in Tucson. I have a house number and a street name, and whatever Center Avenue, and then city, state, zip. Well, my address for my home, where I am from, where I grew up, it is go south on Highway 86 down milepost uh, Indian Route 15 and turn right at the red fence, go down the dirt road, take the Y, which should go to the left, and it's to the right of the big tree. That's literally the address that I would have to give. I would have to draw a map for somebody to go and visit that home. And so despite all of that, people are motivated. They have been, and it is this grassroots movement of people explaining how to participate, because again, these are things. Not only has it been designed so that without us in mind, it's been designed specifically to keep us out. It has been designed that way. And so when we talk about, voter education and things like that, a lot of people they have no idea. They think that it's simply a matter of, and they'll actually say, oh, people are lazy. If they really cared,
Yeah,
they would participate. Yeah.
This is a large part of the film when you finally get to see it, right? It's about plausible deniability. It's about, well, they're not really preventing you from voting. They're just kind of discouraging you from voting, right? It's like if they could put one more barrier in your way, that'll just keep you home on the couch watching The Simpsons instead of going out to vote. If they can shave 1% off the margins, that could be the margin of victory, right? Now, and again, I'm gonna, if I might get a little wonky, right? But if we're going into the Voting Rights Act, right, which Shelby versus Holder took away the pre-clearance regime, right, that basically would have allowed the government to sort of quash these new laws that are all over the place before they were enacted. We now are left with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is a typical lawsuit, right? So Arizona puts these laws in place. All you guys go, this is nonsense, this is racial, we're going to challenge it. You might get an injunction that puts those laws on ice until a ruling comes in, or you might not get an injunction, right? In which case these laws are going to stand. Now, the threshold is disparate racial impact, right? Which is what you just said, right? These laws are overwhelmingly affecting people of color and poor people, right? And so in that case, in Texas, it was happening all the time with their voter ID laws, right? They would get kicked back and they'd say, you know what, this is affecting Latinos and Black people too much. Why don't you tweak it? And then we'll make it okay. The other standard is racial intent, which is, it is our goal to screw over these people, right? Now that's almost impossible to prove unless, as in my film, you're not as bright as the North Carolina legislature was, and they left an email paper trail basically saying, we are here to screw over these people, right? And in which case that was a slam dunk for the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. But the bar is always who is affected. And it's no mistake that you are affected. They're doing it on purpose, right? Now the problem that the GOP has is that it's a white party. So any laws that they enact to screw over Democrats is going to screw over minorities, right? De facto. And they can't split that hair. And it drives them crazy because it opens them up to charges of racism that they feel are not valid. They're like, no, we're trying to maintain power by screwing over Democrats. Well, by screwing over Democrats, you're screwing over people of color, and you can't have it both ways. You see, and so they've really painted themselves into this demographic corner where they have a real hard time enacting these laws and avoiding the racism label that they really don't want, though they can't shake because it just inherently is, you know. And so it's a very interesting to watch them flail about because they really, you know, I've talked to many of them, and it's a theme that's in my film because I give a lot of time to both sides in this film, and they really resent being called racist, right? They really resent it. They don't feel like, yeah, right. And like I say, if the shoe doesn't fit, don't wear it. You know what I mean? But unfortunately, you're wearing a size 11, and this law is kind of a size 11. You know what I mean? So it's a very, they're being hung by their own petard this way. It's just really kind of fascinating to watch.
They brought it up upon themselves, and lately they've been getting a lot more brazen and a lot bolder. We are a little over an hour, so what we're going to do is we're going to do closing remarks to finish us off, but we're going to go backwards. We're going to start with Montserrat, then Flavio, then Gabriela, and then Gavin, if you can close us off. So Montserrat, any closing thoughts on this discussion?
Yeah, again, just so grateful to be here and talking to you about this and the great work, and share about the great work that's happening in our state. Again, folks are not letting challenges like this stop them. We are doing voter registration and political awareness every day, all day, with everyone we come in contact with, and using films just like this to help educate our community, young and old, so that we are aware that there are forces against us, and it is not our fault, and that we are able to do something about it. And I'm so glad to be able to do this for a living and continue to work in the movement space. And I'm ready for the good changes to come. I'm ready for movement candidates and electeds like Gabriela to make the changes that we want to see. And I'm looking forward to us in Arizona diversifying our representation so that we, who represents us, who creates laws, looks a lot like the makeup of the state.
Thank you, Montserrat. Flavio?
Thank you. Yes, I think to visualize the point that Gavin made about how difficult it can be for the GOP to hear just even have a discussion around race. All you have to do is listen in or watch the committee hearings during the Arizona State Legislative Session. I have seen person after person testify and be cut off, been told, all right, no more, we're not going to listen to anybody else. I have people that, they do this when you're typically working 9 to 5. So people might be taking time out of their workday just to testify, to try to offer a public opinion on a bill. And anytime the word race or even privilege is brought up, the conversation is shut down, right? So if we cannot even have a conversation, if people from the public cannot share their concerns with a bill, we are already beyond broken. But a way, something that I think shows maybe a marker of great growth in our state is that this is the first year that there isn't like a flagship anti-immigrant bill at the state legislature. There have been bills and provisions that have discussed border wall funding, but there was not an outright bill. And in many ways, that is because of the foundation that is built for these past 10 years of incredible organizing and holding elected officials accountable. So I invite everybody here, especially those that are from Arizona and based here, to still make calls to the legislative offices and voice your concerns, leave voicemails, still try to engage, even though the door is more often closed than open. Thank you.
Thank you, Flavio. Gabriela?
I just want to encourage anybody who is listening. You know, we are a group who has fallen into the rabbit hole of anti-voter suppression laws, and we live and breathe this. But really, I want to encourage you, if you want to get involved, to go to a meeting, show up somewhere, ask a question, participate in something, even if that's just online. A lot of times, you know, people think about all of this conversation being like inaccessible, and really we just need people to show up, and your presence there and showing physically that you care about something helps to build this change, and it challenges us. I used to be just that person who was carrying around a clipboard registering voters at the school where I worked. And you know, here we are. I'm now an elected official, and we're talking about voter suppression. And so I encourage you. I know that this work, it is a privilege to do this work. You know, it is time away from our families. It is time away from, you know, our jobs, as Flavio just mentioned. But it really just, whatever it is that you can do and however you can participate, we encourage you to do that. The civil rights movement, you know, a lot of times we only think about that in regards to protests and in regards to these big public actions, but a lot of what was happening there were meetings. Show up to a meeting, and we need you. And this is a time when we are challenging everything. Wherever you go, you belong, and just show up.
Thank you so much. And then to close us off, Mr. Guerra, your film, Let the People Decide.
Yeah, I again, thank you so much for hosting this panel and for showing my film at your festival. You know, I wish I could say it wasn't timely or necessary, but you know, that's kind of the point of the film, is that 20 years from now, it's likely to still be timely. This is an ongoing continuum. A couple of closing remarks. One is what I think we've shown in this panel is the importance of local elections, right? That local elections, the more local the election, the greater the impact on your life, right? It's not Joe Biden or your state senator or your senators that are impacting your day-to-day life. It's your school board, it's your county recorder, it's the judges, it's whomever is your county and town elected officials who set policy that affect you in your house today, right? And so I think that anytime there is an election, you should be voting in it, right? And I think that is what people sort of count on you not showing up, because then they just slide things right through and you don't know how you got there, and all of a sudden you can't do stuff anymore, right? So I think that is one. Two, if your vote didn't count, they wouldn't work so hard to keep you from doing it, okay? And I think that is really, you know, in a bumper sticker, that's kind of what the takeaway is. And, you know, there was a saying back in the civil rights movement that if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu, right? And so you always want to be a part of the conversation. And when they start ignoring you, like Flavio was saying, and they're shutting down conversation, it's because they're afraid of you, right? They don't want to have that conversation because they can't win that conversation. And so you gotta exercise your power. And the power of the ballot is really, really huge. And if we are to let the people decide, then we all have to show up and we all have to participate. And, and that's really what I hope people take away from watching the film. I hope they really do get motivated and to get involved. And lastly, one more thing. All these old people in my film were young people when they did all this stuff. Okay, they were all 20 years old. They were all 22. They were all college kids for the most part. The old guy was 26. Okay, so the energy of that civil rights movement that we have come to revere was all youth. Okay, a lot of it, a large part of it was the energy of the youth. So, channel that, because, us old folks can't really keep up that well. So
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you, Montserrat, Flavio, and Mr. Guerra for once again exemplifying what this film festival is all about. We've had films and discussions on immigration, housing, war, a lot more in immigration here because of our proximity to the border, and this particular time about voter suppression, letting filmmakers voice their opinion, let them tell their stories. The Arizona International Film Festival, check it out. Go to the website. There's still time to watch the film, the documentary, great documentary by Gavin Guerra, Let the People Decide, and a whole bunch of other films. About 100 films, 20 countries being represented up until April the 25th, I believe. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to the panel. Have a great Sunday afternoon, and see you tonight at the Mercado Annex. I'm going to be there checking out another film. See you guys.
thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.